Hey guys, tonight we begin one of the longest and most fascinating journeys in all of human history. A journey that starts beside a quiet river flowing through the desert more than 5,000 years ago. A journey that will take us through the age of pyramids and pharaohs, through magnificent temples and forgotten cities, through golden treasures, royal families, ambitious rulers, and ordinary people who simply hoped for a good harvest each year. And by the end of our journey, we will stand beside the final queen of ancient Egypt, Cleopatra herself, as one of the oldest civilizations on Earth slowly fades into history. So find a comfortable place to rest, maybe adjust your blanket, maybe turn down the brightness of your screen, and allow the noise of the modern world to slowly drift away. Tonight, there are no emails to answer, no deadlines to meet, no problems to solve. There is only the Nile, flowing quietly through the darkness, as it has done for thousands upon thousands of years. And our story begins there, long before the pyramids, long before the pharaohs, long before anyone imagined building monuments that would survive into the modern world. The land we now call Egypt looked very different. Much of North Africa was greener than it is today. Grasslands stretched across regions that are now covered by endless desert. Animals wandered freely. Small groups of people moved across the landscape. Life was simple. People hunted, gathered food, built temporary shelters, and followed the rhythm of nature. Nobody was planning giant pyramids. Nobody was carving statues the size of buildings. Most people were simply trying to make it through another day, which, to be fair, remains a surprisingly popular human activity. But over many centuries, the climate slowly changed. The land became drier, rain became less common, water became harder to find. As conditions grew harsher, people gradually moved toward the one place that offered stability, the Nile River. The Nile would become the heart of Egypt, its lifeline, its highway, its source of food, its source of wealth, its source of survival. Every year the river flooded its banks, and while floods often bring disaster, the Nile brought opportunity. When the waters were treated, they left behind rich black soil, perfect for farming, almost as though the river itself was helping people grow food. Farmers quickly learned how valuable this gift was. They planted crops, harvested grain, raised animals, and slowly small villages began appearing along the riverbanks. Generation after generation, these settlements grew. Children became parents, parents became grandparents, and communities slowly transformed into something larger, something more organized, the beginning of civilization. If we could visit Egypt during these early years, the landscape would feel surprisingly peaceful. Simple homes built from mud bricks, small boats drifting across calm waters, farmers tending fields beneath the warm sun, the distant sounds of daily life carrying across the river. Nothing particularly dramatic, nothing particularly exciting, and yet something extraordinary was happening. One of history's greatest civilizations was quietly being born. As centuries passed, different regions grew stronger, communities expanded, trade increased, leaders emerged, and eventually two major kingdoms developed, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Now yes, that sounds backwards, but ancient Egyptians measured direction according to the flow of the Nile, so somehow Upper Egypt ended up in the south. History occasionally enjoys making things slightly confusing. Around 3100 BC, a ruler known as Narmer united these two kingdoms. This was one of the most important moments in Egyptian history. For the first time, Egypt became one nation, one kingdom, one crown, one ruler. And with this unification came a new age, the age of the pharaohs. Now, when most people hear the word pharaoh, they immediately imagine gold masks, enormous palaces, servants waving giant fans, and perhaps someone dramatically pointing toward the horizon while giving royal commands. Reality was probably less dramatic, but pharaohs were certainly powerful. They ruled the kingdom, commanded armies, oversaw religious ceremonies, collected taxes, and according to Egyptian belief, maintained harmony between the human world and the divine world. A fairly demanding job description, especially considering some pharaohs inherited the position as teenagers. Egypt continued growing stronger. Cities expanded, trade routes stretched farther, government became more organized, and before long, Egyptian scribes developed one of humanity's earliest writing systems, hieroglyphics. Today, tourists see hieroglyphics and immediately think of mystery. Ancient Egyptians often saw tax records, because every civilization eventually discovers paperwork, and once paperwork arrives, it tends to stay forever. Still, writing transformed Egyptian society.
Knowledge could be recorded, laws could be preserved, stories could survive. History itself could be written down, and Egypt would soon have a great deal of history worth recording. As the kingdom prospered, rulers became increasingly ambitious. Not satisfied with simply governing Egypt, they wanted to leave behind something permanent, something future generations would remember, something that would survive long after they were gone. Which brings us to one of the most famous chapters in human history, the Age of the Pyramids. Imagine standing beside the Nile more than 4,000 years ago. The morning sun rises slowly above the horizon. Workers begin another day of labor. Stone blocks move across the landscape. Architects examine plans. Foremen organize crews. And gradually, year after year, enormous monuments begin rising from the desert. The pyramids. Even today, they seem almost impossible. Photographs never fully capture their scale. Visitors arrive expecting large structures, then discover something much larger than expected. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu, stood as the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. 4,000. Entire empires appeared and vanished during that time. Meanwhile, the pyramid remained exactly where it was, patiently waiting, watching history unfold. Of course, pyramids were more than engineering projects. They reflected one of the most important Egyptian beliefs, the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians viewed death differently than many people today. They did not see it as an ending. Instead, they saw it as another stage of existence, a continuation of life's journey. And if someone was going to spend eternity somewhere, preparation seemed like a sensible idea. This belief led to elaborate tombs, carefully prepared burials, and eventually mummification. Now, mummification sounds unusual from a modern perspective, but to Egyptians it made perfect sense. Preserve the body, protect the soul, prepare for eternity. Simple enough, at least by ancient standards. Religion touched nearly every part of Egyptian life. The sun god Ra crossed the sky each day. Osiris ruled the afterlife. Isis protected families. Horus watched over kings. Anubis guided souls through death. The gods were everywhere, in temples, in festivals, in daily routines, in stories passed from parents to children. For Egyptians, religion was not something separate from life. It was woven into life itself. And for centuries, Egypt flourished. The Nile flooded. Fields produced food. Trade brought wealth. Monuments grew larger. The population expanded. Life followed familiar rhythms, the kind of rhythms that make a civilization feel eternal. But history has a habit of reminding people that nothing lasts forever. Even the strongest kingdoms face challenges. And slowly, almost quietly, cracks began to appear. Power shifted away from the pharaoh. Regional leaders gained influence. The central government weakened. The age of the great pyramid builders slowly came to an end. Egypt entered a period of uncertainty, a time when nobody knew exactly what the future would bring. But Egypt was far from finished. In fact, some of its most remarkable chapters still lay ahead. New dynasties, new temples, new conquerors, new legends, and rulers whose names would echo through thousands of years of history. As the evening sun slowly disappears beyond the horizon, the Nile continues flowing northward through the darkness. Past villages, past farms, past temples, past people who could never have imagined that their story would still be told thousands of years later. And as Egypt moves into a new chapter, the kingdom begins preparing for another rise.
And without realizing it, the people living beside the Nile were about to witness the beginning of one of the greatest eras in Egyptian history. For a time, Egypt had struggled. The authority of the pharaoh had weakened, regional leaders competed for power, and the kingdom that had once built the mighty pyramids no longer seemed quite so certain of itself. Yet life along the Nile continued. The river still flooded each year, farmers still planted grain, boats still drifted quietly across the water. Children still grew up listening to stories about gods and ancient kings. To ordinary people, daily life often felt more important than politics. After all, crops needed planting whether the kingdom was united or not. And eventually, strong rulers began restoring order. Slowly, patiently, one step at a time, the divided regions of Egypt were brought together once again. Cities recovered, trade expanded, and confidence returned. Historians would later call this period the Middle Kingdom. For many Egyptians, it felt like a fresh beginning. Imagine waking up beside the Nile during these years. The morning air is cool, mist drifts gently above the water, fishing boats move silently through the river. The first rays of sunlight begin touching the fields. Everything feels calm, predictable, comforting. The Nile had become something like an old friend, always present, always reliable, always returning. Its annual floods remained the foundation of Egyptian life. When the waters arrived, farmers welcomed them. The floods covered the land, then slowly retreated, leaving behind rich black soil, perfect for growing crops. Without modern machinery, without advanced technology, Egyptian farmers managed to produce enough food to support one of the largest civilizations on Earth. Not bad for a society working thousands of years before electricity. As agriculture improved, towns grew larger. Markets became busier. Merchants traveled farther. Goods moved up and down the Nile every day. Boats carried grain, stone, wood, livestock, and sometimes luxury items destined for wealthy nobles. The river served as Egypt's great highway, a highway with surprisingly few traffic jams, at least compared to modern standards. As prosperity returned, pharaohs once again turned their attention toward building projects. Egyptian rulers had a habit of wanting to leave something behind. A temple, a monument, a statue, something that would survive long after they were gone. And honestly, many of them succeeded. Thousands of years later, visitors still travel across the world to admire their work. Temples grew larger, columns reached higher into the sky, walls filled with detailed carvings. Every surface seemed to tell a story. Scenes of victories, religious ceremonies, offerings to the gods, moments that rulers hoped would never be forgotten. Religion remained deeply woven into everyday life. The gods were everywhere, not just inside temples, but in the minds of ordinary people. When the sun rose, many Egyptians thought of Ra. When crops grew successfully, they thanked the gods. When challenges appeared, they prayed for guidance. Life and religion were impossible to separate. One flowed naturally into the other. Much like the Nile itself, Egyptians believed the universe operated according to a sacred balance known as Ma'at. Order, truth, harmony. Everything had its proper place. The pharaoh's duty was to protect this balance, not just politically, but spiritually as well, which sounds like an exhausting amount of responsibility. Most modern leaders struggle to answer emails. Ancient pharaohs were expected to maintain cosmic order, and somehow the kingdom continued functioning. Meanwhile, Egyptian craftsmen became increasingly skilled. Jewelry became more intricate, statues more detailed, art more refined. Workshops throughout the kingdom produced beautiful objects from gold, stone, wood, and precious materials. Many of these creations eventually found their way into tombs because Egyptians never stopped preparing for the afterlife. The idea of eternity remained central to their culture. Death was not viewed as a final destination. Instead, it was simply another journey, a continuation, a new chapter. And so tombs were carefully prepared. Mummies were protected, and possessions were gathered for use in the next world. One can only admire their commitment to long-term planning. As Egypt became wealthier, its influence expanded beyond its borders. Trade reached distant lands. Foreign merchants arrived with unusual goods. New ideas entered the kingdom. The world beyond Egypt slowly became more connected. Yet even during these prosperous years, challenges remained. History rarely allows civilizations to relax for very long. New groups appeared beyond Egypt's borders. Some came to trade, others came seeking opportunities, and a few arrived with ambitions of their own. Far to the northeast, powerful new forces were beginning to emerge. At first, these developments may have seemed distant, easy to ignore. Life beside the Nile remained peaceful. Harvests continued. Festivals filled the calendar. Families gathered for meals. The kingdom appeared strong. But beyond the horizon, change was quietly approaching. The sort of change that often arrives gradually, so gradually that few people notice it at first. Years pass, then decades, and suddenly the world looks different. Egypt was about to experience one of those moments, a period that would challenge the kingdom in unexpected ways, a period that would force Egyptians to adapt, to learn, and ultimately to become stronger than ever before. Because sometimes history's greatest achievements emerge from difficult circumstances. And as evening settles over the Nile once again, the river continues flowing northward, beneath a sky filled with stars. The fields grow quiet. The temples fall silent. Families gather inside their homes. And somewhere in the darkness, a new chapter of Egyptian history was already beginning to unfold. At first, nobody along the Nile could have known how much the future was about to change. The river still flowed as it always had. The crops still grew. The temple still welcomed worshippers. And the pharaoh still ruled from his palace. Life appeared stable, comfortable even. But history often changes quietly, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a warning. Sometimes change arrives slowly, one small step at a time. And that was exactly what was happening now. Far beyond Egypt's borders, new groups of people were moving across the ancient world. Some were traders, some were travelers, some were families searching for opportunity, and among them were people who would eventually become known as the Hyksos. For years, they entered Egypt gradually. Many settled in the northern regions. At first, their presence was not particularly alarming. Ancient Egypt had always interacted with neighboring peoples. Trade routes connected different cultures. Foreign merchants were nothing unusual. Life continued much as before. But over time, the Hyksos became more influential, more powerful, and eventually they gained control over parts of northern Egypt. For Egyptians, this was something entirely new. For centuries they had viewed their kingdom as the center of the world, the land favored by the gods, the home of the pharaoh. Now outsiders ruled part of that land. It must have felt deeply unsettling. Imagine growing up believing your kingdom was eternal, then waking up one day to discover foreign rulers controlling important cities. Even so, daily life continued, because daily life always continues. Farmers still woke before sunrise. Fishermen still cast their nets. Children still played near the riverbanks. The Nile, as always, seemed completely uninterested in politics. It simply kept flowing north. The Hyksos brought something that fascinated the Egyptians: horse-drawn chariots. Today, a chariot may not seem particularly impressive, but thousands of years ago, it represented advanced military technology. Fast, mobile, effective. Egyptians observed carefully. They learned, they adapted, and perhaps most importantly, they remembered. Because one thing Egyptian civilization did remarkably well was survive. Again and again. Whenever challenges appeared, Egypt found ways to evolve. Years passed, then decades. The desire to reclaim the kingdom never disappeared. In southern Egypt, local rulers slowly gathered strength. They organized armies, built alliances, prepared for the future. Patience became their greatest weapon. Eventually, leaders from the south launched campaigns against the Hyksos. The struggle lasted years, but little by little the balance shifted. The Egyptians pushed northward. Cities were reclaimed. Territories returned to Egyptian control. And finally, the Hyksos were driven out. Egypt was united once again. The victory changed everything. The kingdom emerged stronger, more confident, and more ambitious than ever before. The Egyptians had learned valuable lessons. They had seen foreign military technology. They had experienced invasion, and they had no intention of allowing it to happen again. This moment marked the beginning of a remarkable new era, the New Kingdom, often considered the greatest age in Egyptian history, an era of wealth, power, expansion, and legendary rulers. The pharaohs of this era thought big, very big. Some wanted to build massive temples. Others wanted military victories. Most wanted both. And honestly, who could blame them? If history remembers you for thousands of years, it helps to leave behind something impressive. As Egypt expanded its influence, armies traveled farther than ever before. Trade networks stretched across vast distances. Gold flowed into the kingdom. Foreign goods arrived in growing numbers. The royal treasury became increasingly wealthy. Temples grew larger. Palaces became more elaborate. The kingdom entered an era of extraordinary prosperity. Imagine standing beside the Nile during this period. The cities are busy. Markets overflow with goods. Merchants negotiate prices. Priests perform ceremonies. Government officials record shipments and taxes. Everything feels alive. Everything feels confident. Egypt has become one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. And nowhere is that confidence more visible than in its architecture. Across the kingdom, enormous building projects appear. Temple complexes rise from the landscape. Statues tower above visitors.
Stone columns seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. Many of these structures still stand today, a reminder of what determined people can achieve with enough time, resources, and patience. Among the most remarkable rulers of this era was a woman named Hatshepsut. Now, female rulers were relatively rare in ancient history, but Hatshepsut proved exceptionally capable. She governed effectively, encouraged trade, supported construction projects, and helped strengthen the kingdom. Her reign brought stability and prosperity. Not every ruler spent their time conquering enemies. Sometimes building and governing worked perfectly well, a surprisingly sensible approach. As years passed, Egypt continued flourishing. The Nile remained generous. The harvests remained strong. The temples remained busy. The kingdom seemed unstoppable. Yet even during this golden age, new ideas were beginning to emerge. Ideas that would challenge ancient traditions. Ideas that would reshape religion itself. And at the center of those changes would stand one of Egypt's most unusual pharaohs, a ruler whose decisions would confuse historians for thousands of years. But that story belongs to another evening. For now, the sun slowly sets over the Nile once again. Golden light reflects across the water. The distant sounds of the city begin to fade. Boats return to shore. Temple doors close for the night.
And Egypt, now stronger than ever before, prepared to enter another fascinating chapter of its long and remarkable story. For generations, the kingdom had grown wealthier, its armies were respected, its temples were magnificent, its rulers commanded enormous resources. From the outside, everything appeared stable, the kind of stability that makes people believe things will continue forever. History, however, has a habit of surprising everyone, and somewhere within the royal court, a young prince was growing up who would eventually challenge traditions that had existed for more than 1,000 years. His name was Amenhotep IV. At least that was his name at first. When he became pharaoh, Egypt expected another traditional ruler, another king who would honor the ancient gods, support the temples, and continue doing what previous pharaohs had always done. Instead, he decided to do something entirely different, which, as history repeatedly demonstrates, tends to make life interesting. At the heart of Egyptian religion stood countless gods: Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, and many others. For centuries, these deities had shaped Egyptian culture. Temples honored them, priests served them, families prayed to them. The system felt permanent. Then, Amenhotep IV began focusing his attention on a single deity, Aten, the sun disk. Gradually, his devotion grew stronger, and eventually he took an extraordinary step. He changed his own name. Amenhotep IV became Akhenaten, a name associated with his devotion to Aten. It was more than a personal choice. It signaled a dramatic shift in Egyptian religion. Akhenaten promoted the worship of Aten above all other gods. Ancient temples lost influence. Traditional religious practices were challenged. New temples were built. New artwork appeared. New ideas spread throughout the kingdom. Imagine being an ordinary Egyptian during this period. For generations, your family had worshipped familiar gods. Your grandparents had prayed to them. Your parents had prayed to them. Now suddenly the pharaoh was encouraging something entirely different. It must have felt confusing, perhaps even unsettling. Many people probably adapted. Others may have remained skeptical. Human nature has not changed very much over the centuries. Most people tend to be cautious when long-established traditions suddenly disappear. Akhenaten's changes extended beyond religion. Egyptian art also transformed during his reign. Royal portraits became more natural, more relaxed, less rigid than traditional depictions. Instead of showing perfect and timeless rulers, artists portrayed members of the royal family in more personal settings. The results were unique. Even today, historians can often recognize artwork from Akhenaten's reign immediately. It simply looks different. Standing beside Akhenaten throughout these changes was his famous queen, Nefertiti. Few figures from ancient Egypt have captured modern imagination quite like her. Her image remains one of the most recognizable from the ancient world, and although many details of her life remain uncertain, she clearly held an important position within the royal court. Together, Akhenaten and Nefertiti oversaw one of the most unusual periods in Egyptian history, a time when old traditions were questioned, new beliefs emerged, and the kingdom experimented with dramatic change. Yet despite these efforts, not everyone embraced the new system. The traditional priesthood remained powerful,
Ancient beliefs remained deeply rooted, and many Egyptians continued feeling connected to the old gods. The kingdom itself also faced challenges beyond religion. Foreign affairs required attention, diplomatic relationships demanded care, and while Akhenaten focused heavily on spiritual matters, some areas of government appear to have received less attention. As the years passed, uncertainty slowly grew. Eventually, Akhenaten died, and Egypt found itself facing an important question. What would happen next? The answer arrived in the form of a young boy, a child who would become one of the most famous pharaohs in history, though not because of anything he accomplished while ruling. His name was Tutankhaten, later known to the world as Tutankhamun. When he became pharaoh, he was still very young, far too young to govern entirely on his own. Experienced advisors helped manage the kingdom, and one of their first priorities was restoring stability. The religious revolution of Akhenaten began to fade. Traditional gods returned, ancient temples reopened, old customs reappeared. Even the young king's name changed. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, reflecting renewed devotion to the traditional religious system. For many Egyptians, it likely felt like a return to normal, a return to familiar traditions, a return to the world they had always known. Tutankhamun's reign was relatively short. He ruled for only a brief period before dying unexpectedly at a young age. At the time, few could have guessed that he would become the most famous pharaoh in modern history, because during his lifetime he was not considered one of Egypt's greatest rulers, not the richest, not the most powerful, not the greatest conqueror. Yet history sometimes chooses favorites in surprising ways, and centuries later, an extraordinary discovery would transform Tutankhamun into a global legend. But that story lies far ahead. For now, Egypt continued moving forward. The kingdom remained wealthy, its temples remained impressive, its people continued living beside the Nile, planting crops, building homes, raising families, and watching the seasons pass. As evening settles across the river once more, warm sunlight fades from the temple walls. The sounds of the marketplace grow quiet. The waters of the Nile reflect the first stars of the night, and somewhere beyond the horizon, new rulers are preparing to leave their mark upon history. Among them will be one of the greatest pharaohs Egypt has ever known, a king whose monuments would tower above the landscape, a ruler whose name would survive for more than 3,000 years.
And as the kingdom entered another age of power and ambition, the story of ancient Egypt continued its slow journey forward. The years passed. The Nile continued its endless flow toward the sea. Farmers harvested their crops, priests performed their ceremonies, and Egypt gradually moved beyond the unusual years of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. The old gods had returned. The temples were active once again, and the kingdom was ready for a new generation of rulers. Some would be remembered, others would fade into history, but among them stood one pharaoh whose name would echo across thousands of years, Ramesses II. Today we often call him Ramesses the Great, and honestly few rulers have worked harder to earn a title like that. When Ramesses became pharaoh, Egypt was already powerful. Its armies were respected, its cities were prosperous, its monuments impressed visitors from distant lands. Yet Ramesses wanted more, much more. He wanted Egypt to be remembered as the greatest kingdom in the world, and he wanted himself to be remembered as its greatest ruler. A very modest goal, of course. During his reign, construction projects appeared across Egypt. Temples expanded, statues multiplied, monuments rose from the desert. Wherever people traveled, they seemed to encounter another image of Ramesses, sometimes enormous, sometimes absolutely gigantic. It was almost as if the pharaoh wanted future generations to have absolutely no chance of forgetting him. And judging by the fact that we are discussing him more than 3,000 years later, the strategy worked surprisingly well. Imagine standing beside one of his colossal statues. The figure towers above you. Its face gazes calmly across the landscape. Its size makes ordinary people appear tiny by comparison. Visitors must have been impressed, perhaps slightly intimidated, which was probably part of the plan. Ramesses understood something important about leadership. Symbols matter. Monuments matter. Stories matter. People remember what they can see, and Egypt gave them plenty to see. One of the most famous building projects associated with Ramesses was Abu Simbel. Carved directly into a mountainside, the temple remains one of the most remarkable achievements of the ancient world. Even today, visitors often find themselves staring at it in silence. Not because anyone tells them to be quiet,
but because some structures naturally inspire awe. The builders of Abu Simbel created something extraordinary, and somehow, after more than 3,000 years, it still commands attention. Yet Ramesses was not interested only in construction. Like many rulers of the ancient world, he also focused on military campaigns. Egypt competed with powerful neighboring kingdoms. Diplomacy remained important, but so did strength. One of the most famous events of Ramesses' reign was the Battle of Kadesh, a massive confrontation involving Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Historians still discuss it today, not because it produced a clear winner, but because both sides claimed success afterward, which, when you think about it, sounds remarkably familiar. Human beings have always been creative when describing their achievements. Eventually, Egypt and the Hittites negotiated peace. In fact, they created one of the earliest known peace treaties in history, a reminder that even powerful kingdoms sometimes decide cooperation is easier than endless conflict. Meanwhile, life for ordinary Egyptians continued much as it always had. Most people were not thinking about diplomacy. Most people were not studying international politics. They were planting crops, repairing fishing nets, raising children, preparing meals, and living their lives beside the Nile. History often focuses on kings and queens, but civilizations are really built by ordinary people. The farmer tending a field, the boatman crossing the river, the artisan carving stone, the merchant selling goods in a busy market. Together, they formed the foundation of Egyptian society, and while pharaohs received the glory, millions of ordinary people kept the kingdom running. As Ramesses grew older, his reign seemed almost endless. Year followed year, then decade followed decade. Children grew into adults, adults became grandparents, and still Ramesses remained on the throne. For many Egyptians, he was simply the pharaoh they had always known, a permanent part of life, like the Nile or the desert or the annual flood. But even the longest reign eventually comes to an end, and when Ramesses finally died after more than 60 years as ruler, Egypt lost one of its most remarkable kings. His achievements were enormous, his monuments were everywhere, his influence touched every corner of the kingdom. Yet despite all his accomplishments, he could not stop the passage of time. No ruler ever can. After Ramesses, Egypt remained powerful, but subtle changes were beginning to appear. The empire became harder to manage, foreign pressures increased, economic challenges emerged. Nothing dramatic at first, just small signs that the future might not resemble the past. The kind of changes people often ignore until much later, because when a civilization has survived for thousands of years, it is easy to assume it will continue forever. Many Egyptians likely felt exactly that way. After all, their kingdom had endured countless challenges, periods of division, foreign invasions, political struggles, and yet Egypt always seemed to recover. Why would the future be any different? For now, though, nobody was worrying about decline. The temples remained active, the harvests continued, the cities remained busy, and the Nile flowed peacefully beneath the warm Egyptian sun. As evening settles over the river once again, fishermen pull their boats onto shore, families gather for supper, the last light of day fades across distant temple walls, and somewhere beyond the horizon, forces are beginning to emerge that will slowly reshape the ancient world. Not overnight, not suddenly, but little by little, year by year, century by century, the long golden age of Egypt is beginning to drift toward its final chapters, though nobody living beside the Nile can see it yet.
And for now, the kingdom rested beneath the stars, unaware that some of its greatest challenges still lay ahead. From the perspective of an ordinary Egyptian, life probably still seemed stable. The Nile continued its annual floods. The fields remained fertile. Temples welcomed worshippers. Markets bustled with activity. And although rulers came and went, Egypt itself appeared eternal. After all, it had already survived for thousands of years. Entire civilizations had risen and disappeared while Egypt remained standing. Why would that ever change? Yet history rarely remains still for long. Far beyond Egypt's borders, the ancient world was beginning to shift. Trade routes became less reliable. Powerful kingdoms faced difficulties. Long-established systems began showing signs of strain. Nobody fully understood what was happening. Even modern historians continue debating the details. But one thing is certain. A period of uncertainty was spreading across the eastern Mediterranean, and eventually, Egypt would feel its effects. Among the most mysterious groups of this era were people known today as the Sea Peoples. To be honest, historians still do not know exactly who all of them were. They seem to have come from various regions, moving across the Mediterranean, searching for land, resources, or perhaps simply survival. Ancient records describe them appearing unexpectedly. Kingdom after kingdom struggled to stop them. Some civilizations collapsed entirely, others barely survived. For many people living at the time, it must have felt as though the world itself was becoming less predictable. Egypt eventually faced these newcomers as well. The pharaohs organized defenses, armies prepared for conflict, and once again, the kingdom relied upon careful planning and determination. Fortunately for Egypt, its leaders responded effectively. The invasions were resisted. The kingdom survived. But survival came at a cost. Wars require resources. Defenses require money. And maintaining a vast empire was becoming increasingly difficult. The challenges did not disappear when the battles ended. Instead, they slowly accumulated, like grains of sand gathering in the desert, small at first, then impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Egypt's enormous empire became harder to manage. Territories far from the Nile demanded attention. Local officials required supervision. Communication remained slow. A message could take days or weeks to reach its destination. For rulers trying to govern a large empire, patience was essential, and perhaps a very good memory. As the years passed, the central government gradually weakened. Not dramatically, not all at once, just little by little. The sort of change most people barely notice while it is happening. Temples continued operating, festivals continued, families continued their daily routines. Life still felt familiar. But beneath the surface, Egypt was changing. The power of local leaders increased. Priests gained greater influence. Regional interests sometimes became more important than national unity. The balance that had once made Egypt so strong became harder to maintain. And yet, despite these difficulties, the civilization remained impressive. Travelers arriving in Egypt would still have seen magnificent temples, enormous statues, busy cities, thriving communities. The signs of greatness remained visible everywhere. One reason Egypt endured for so long was its extraordinary ability to adapt. Generation after generation, Egyptians adjusted to changing circumstances. They rebuilt when necessary, reorganized when required, and continued moving forward. Few civilizations have demonstrated such resilience. But even resilience has limits. As centuries passed, foreign powers became increasingly interested in Egypt. Not because Egypt was weak, quite the opposite. Egypt remained wealthy, its land remained fertile, its position remained valuable, and powerful neighbors noticed. To the south, kingdoms watched carefully. To the east, new empires expanded their influence. To the north, political changes reshaped the wider world. Egypt increasingly found itself surrounded by ambitious rivals. For ordinary people, however, these developments often felt distant. A farmer working beside the Nile was more concerned about crops than international politics. A fisherman cared more about the day's catch than the ambitions of foreign rulers. Life continued much as it always had. Morning followed night, the seasons changed, the river flooded, children grew older, and the familiar rhythms of daily life carried on. Perhaps that is one of the most comforting aspects of history. Even during times of uncertainty, people continue living their lives. They laugh, work, rest, dream, and hope for the future. The ancient Egyptians were no different. As another generation passed, Egypt slowly entered a new phase of its long story. Not yet a collapse, not yet an ending, but certainly a transition. The great age of empire was fading. A different world was beginning to emerge. A world where foreign rulers would increasingly influence Egyptian affairs. A world where ancient traditions would face new challenges. And a world that would eventually bring Egypt face to face with some of the greatest conquerors in history. But those events still lay ahead. For now, evening settles gently across the Nile once again. The water reflects the colors of the setting sun.
Palm trees sway softly in the warm breeze. Temple walls glow with the last light of day. And somewhere in the distance, an elderly storyteller shares memories of Egypt's golden age, a time of mighty pharaohs, great victories, and endless prosperity, perhaps wondering if those glorious days will ever return. As darkness slowly covers the land, the Nile continues its timeless journey toward the sea.